Chapter 4. A Princess No Longer. An endless torrent of rain fell from the darkened clouds above the fields of Hyrule, feeding the trees, grass, and flowers that grew from the soil on which the princess sat. Protected from the moisture, having planted herself under a canopy of branches and leaves as she rested her back against a large boulder the tree had grown beside, she watched as the dark clouds floated above them. While her eyes seemed focused on the rain, her mind was elsewhere. Guilt filled her. For only a day prior, she had once again proven powerless in one of the 3 sacred springs of Hyrule. The rain was a hindrance to their journey. To the princess, that was a good thing. A blessing, in fact. She could prolong having to feel the weight of her father's disappointed eyes, avoid those in the castle with their poorly hidden judgmental stares, and most of all, she could spend more time with him. Her eyes traveled from the rain down to the knight that accompanied her. While she sat safely under the tree, the knight stood in the rain, swinging around his long mythical sword. She watched as he twirled in the rain, droplets of water flying from his wet blue tunic and the ends of his hair. His gaze was focused as he faced off against whatever invisible foe he imagined in front of him. She admired his determination, and, truth be told, it was that very same determination that kept her even slightly motivated to keep praying at the springs, though even a quality as powerful as his couldn't keep that strong forever. Still, it was wonderful to see him gracefully dance with his blade, yet the idea that he was focusing on it more than her bothered her slightly. She blinked. Even for her, that was a surprising thought. Had she really become that possessive over him, so much that even his sword was a rival for his attention? While she blushed at her silliness, it was that very same silliness that won the moment she opened her mouth to speak.
Link, you'll catch a cold practicing in the rain like that. Are you sure you shouldn't take shelter like I have?
It's fine. I'm sure the rain will stop soon. Besides, this is the perfect time to practice. I can't always expect to have dry land to fight on.
I suppose that's a fair argument.
Disheartened that he hadn't picked up on her invitation to join her side, the princess frowned and looked back up at the dark clouds above.
Still, you say the rain will come to an end quickly, but I doubt this will let up anytime soon.
The knight didn't respond, something that, at least these days, was quite rare for him. Though it was fascinating to see him in such an admirable state of concentration, after her failure the day prior, she couldn't help but want his attention a little more than usual. Clearing her throat, she began to speak again, choosing the first thing that came to mind.
Your path seems to mirror your father's. You've dedicated yourself to becoming a knight as well. Your commitment to the training necessary to fulfill your goal is really quite admirable. I see now why you would be the chosen one.
Hearing these words, Link's practice swing stopped. Exhaling a calm breath, still holding his blade at the ready as raindrops splashed on his clothing, hair, and sword, he glanced back at the princess watching him. Noticing his glance, the princess shook her head.
Don't worry. I don't speak from jealousy like before. No, I truly mean what I say.
I didn't doubt that for a moment, Zelda.
Princess Zelda returned his tiny smile with one of her own. For him to call her something so personal was actually a request given to him herself. She wanted to be close to him, even if only when it was just the two of them. She felt guilty, for if anyone were to find out about his lack of respect, he would most certainly be in trouble. Yet she couldn't help but desire that connection.
I am curious as to why you bring it up, though.
Why, you ask? I simply wanted to encourage you, is all. Is that so wrong?
Not at all, Princess.
Honestly, since discovering your laid-back nature, it makes me wonder why you wanted to become a knight at all. Was it really just your father's inspiration?
What made me want to become a knight? I have my reasons.
Reasons, you say?
Link nodded, confident in his answer. Giving a light sigh, realizing she wasn't going to get a clearer answer than that, she watched as he swung his sword a few more times. Watching him, yesterday's trip to the spring appeared in her mind again, just before another question followed.
What if, one day, you realized that you just weren't meant to be a fighter?
At this, Link furrowed his brow and finally lowered his sword as he turned to face the princess.
You realize this? Yet the only thing people ever said was that you were born into a family of the royal guard, and so, no matter what you thought, you had to become a knight.
With an inscrutable expression on his face, Link looked over at the princess, causing her to avert her eyes, staring down at the rain-soaked grass surrounding them instead.
If that was the only thing that you were ever told, I wonder then, would you have chosen a different path?
Falling silent, she sat under the tree, unable to look the knight in the eyes as she awaited an answer. She could feel his eyes on her, and while she usually found herself wanting to meet his gaze, this time she couldn't bring herself to look at him. She once again had made the conversation about her and the conflicted feelings that swarmed in her chest, and yet she was so curious about his answer that she couldn't take her question back. So she sat in silence, waiting to hear what he had to say. For a moment, all she could hear was the ambience of the rain in her pointed ears.
I know what you're trying to ask, but even if you phrase it like that, our situations are slightly different. Similar, but not the same.
Zelda closed her eyes in guilt. Of course he wouldn't have an answer, possibly because there wasn't one. His duty was different to hers, no matter how similar they may be, nor how much he understood the weight on her shoulders. While the pressure was the same, the paths were still different. Taking a moment to collect herself, she took a deep breath.
I apologize, Link. I didn't mean to.
Now, if you had asked me how I would feel if people told me I was destined to pull this sword, and I couldn't no matter how hard I pulled for years, then...
Unable to help herself, Zelda looked up to meet Link's gaze, yet he was no longer looking at her. His bright blue eyes were on the legendary purple-winged blade in his hand.
I don't know. Maybe not. At least, that's what I think.
He continued to stare at the sword as he stood in the rain, and Zelda took in his answer. Even if his path was slightly different, he still understood her. Swallowing, Zelda asked another question.
And what about now? Or, well, you said you have a reason for becoming a knight, right? Now that you have this duty, a burden no one should ever have to ask of you, once the calamity is gone, would you remain a knight after that?
Tearing his gaze away from the sword, their eyes finally met.
When the calamity is gone, will you still continue to be a knight?
The grassy fields and leaves of Hyrule danced in the breeze, still burned and bruised from the battle that had taken place the evening prior. Though still burning, the remaining flames ablaze across the land had lost their pink glow, reverting to regular orange and diminishing with each passing hour. Most of the wildlife that had lived in the fields and the few tiny forests, already much reduced in population due to decades of spider-legged machines roaming the area, had all vanished, instinctively knowing it would be best to return after the monstrous boar that threatened their homes had departed for good. This left nothing but the whispering sound of the wind and the susurration of grass and leaves until a sweetly whistled tune sounded through the air. Perking up its ears, the last beast that remained in the field lifted its head. Having eaten enough of whatever remaining healthy grass could be found, the chestnut-coated, white-maned horse neighed, reared up on its hind legs, and galloped toward the shadowy castle in the distance. After only a few minutes, the mare's owner and his princess came into view, standing in the remains of what used to be a grand town, now flattened in front of the castle it once proudly accented. The horse slowed to a stop, allowing her owner to place a hand on her side and brush her coat in appreciation.
Thanks, Epona. I know we had quite the day yesterday. I'm sorry for putting you through that. I'll make it up to you, I promise. But can you make a few more trips before I do?
Blowing air through her nostrils, Epona shook her white mane. Link smiled gently as he began adjusting her saddle.
Atta girl. Alright. Are you ready, Zelda?
I am, but may I ask you something? Why aren't we using the Sheikah Slate? I know how much you like to ride, but is now the time to indulge like this? I'd assume Impa would want to see me as soon as possible.
Well, I had actually planned on using the slate, but the more I think about it, the more I wonder if it's safe to use.
What do you mean?
It's only ever been used to move just one person. I know it worked when you brought me to the tower, and just now when we went to the castle, but I think we should still let Paya take a look at it before we use it to travel anymore. Is that alright?
Yes, that's fine. I trust your judgment. You've used the slate more in depth than I have during your time with it. I'm sure you're right. It must be dangerous to fast travel with two people at the same time, without any kind of calibration.
With a nod in agreement while finishing the saddle's preparations, Link placed his foot onto the stirrup before pushing himself up onto the seat. Once adjusted, he reached down to Zelda, who took his hand and allowed him to pull her up into position. She had assumed she would be sitting behind him, yet, to her surprise, she now sat in front and in between his legs. She could feel her cheeks starting to burn as he reached around her to take the reins in hand. With a light tap of his heel against Epona's sides, the mare began to trot, slowly speeding up as they crossed the fields.
Link, why am I in the front?
Assuming all the monsters have been revived in Hyrule, just as before, then there'll be some on the path to Kakariko. With you in front, I won't have to worry about any arrows hitting you from behind. Are you uncomfortable?
No, not at all. Actually, this is quite nice.
What was that?
Nothing. I'm perfectly fine up here. Thank you.
Soon, Epona had brought herself to a proper gallop, speeding through the plains of Hyrule Field toward the dueling peaks. Eventually, she found herself on the path where they stayed before arriving next to a river. While the ride was pleasant, more so than usual thanks to Link's riding skill, Zelda felt as though she would burst from embarrassment. She felt as though she would have been enjoying the breeze rushing through her hair or the view of the land she had fought so hard to protect, yet those were some of the last things on her mind. The more she rocked on the saddle, the more she could feel her back pressing against Link's chest and her thighs pressing against his. She could feel every motion he made while guiding the horse, turning, pulling back the reins, and urging forward. With him being so close, she only just realized how much his body shielded her. While a small difference from before, it was still very clear. Link had grown.
This is your first time being on a horse in a while, isn't it?
Technically speaking, but mentally, it feels like it's only been a few days since our last journey together on horses. Sort of. I'm still unsure of how to explain it.
Well, regardless, don't panic.
Excuse me? Link! What are you doing? Why did you let go of the reins?
You have to trust your mount, Zelda. She'll follow the road on her own as long as she stays calm, so don't do anything to startle her, okay?
Alright, but what are you doing?
Link didn't respond. Instead, he pulled the Sheikah slate from his belt. After a few taps, a simple wooden bow decorated with iron plates and blue leather straps appeared in his hand. Placing the slate back on his hip and taking a normal arrow out from the quiver on his back, he knocked it into position before aiming and pulling back on the drawstring. Confused about what he was aiming at, Zelda looked around before noticing a bunch of trees on the side of the path near one of the mountain cliffs, one of which was larger than the rest. This tree had what appeared to be a crudely made loft that wrapped around its trunk. The lookout was adorned with cloths, bones, and horned skulls, with monsters standing guard at their post. They were strange creatures. From a distance, they appeared short and squat, their torsos and arms freakishly long, with surprisingly stubby legs and disproportionately large, wide heads. Despite these oddities, they were sizable creatures, possessing porcine characteristics. Their ears were broad and floppy, and they had snouts instead of noses. Their beady eyes glowed red with bloodlust, while their bodies were covered with the hides, pelts, and bones of their prey. To most, these creatures, known as bokoblins, would be something to fear, especially when posted in their camps and such numbers. To Link, however, this wasn't an issue. Unbeknownst to Zelda, he had begun holding in a deep breath, causing time to slow around him. The sound of hooves galloping against the path, the strands of long golden hair flowing in the breeze, and even his own heartbeat slowed almost to a halt, all except his reflexes. With incredible accuracy and speed, he released his arrow before immediately knocking another one. One after another, arrows flew through the air at a slow pace before eventually, Link lowered his bow. After ensuring he had counted properly, he released his breath, allowing time to flow once more. In Zelda's eyes, she perceived the entire event within a split second. The air suddenly filled with flying arrows, their heads immediately piercing a bokoblin target deep into their skull. With cries of pain, every bokoblin fell from their post and onto the ground, joining those who had been stationed there already and had fallen lifelessly with their faces planted into the grass. Impressed, Zelda had begun to turn, ready to commend Link for his archery skills, yet the feeling of him pulling back the drawstring of his bow again stopped her. As they rode beside the river that flowed through the mountain pass, he continued to fire arrows, some striking down into the water to stop rock-spitting octoroks, while others flew across the river entirely to finish off a bokoblin camp on the river's opposite bank. Soon, they exited the mountain pass and followed a bend in the road, leading them to a wooden bridge that allowed them to cross the river where a stable awaited any weary travelers. Zelda watched in awe as they closed in on the large, strange, tent-like stable with an enormous horse head above its roof. As they passed, both riders waved, receiving some in return from the stablemaster and his workers, along with any other traveler who happened to be sitting outside around the cooking pot near the tent's entrance. They continued down the path, passing rolling fields and ruined towns before spying a herd of running horses. Though she had never really been too fond of horses, Link noticed his passenger smile at the bolting herd that galloped beside them before they turned away, sprinting in the opposite direction toward the ruin-filled hills as Epona crossed the mossy, rickety remains of a stone bridge spanning a vast, turbulent lake. Soon, the path climbed other mountains in the area, where Zelda knew the village of Kakariko rested in the center, awaiting their arrival.
Are you alright? You've grown quiet.
I'm quite fine, yes.
Zelda had replied without looking back at him. This, of course, was a lie. The strange feeling she had gotten on the tower when she woke up to Link's absence had returned.
I would be nervous too if I were in your place.
My place?
You haven't seen Impa in over 100 years. I promise you she hasn't changed that much. If what little memory I have of her is true, then she's actually loosened up quite a bit.
Oh, that's what you meant. I appreciate that, Link. Thank you.
While this certainly was a minor fear, she couldn't help but feel relieved that he hadn't divined the other emotions she felt swirling deep around inside of her. Still lost in her thoughts, she continued to try her best and enjoy the ride. After weaving through the mountain path for a while, an arch appeared before them, marking the entrance to the village. It was a uniquely designed arch, built with specially carved wooden beams, some skillfully curved, others straight. Red cloth hung from the beams, accentuating the simple gray banners depicting a white eyeball with a single teardrop, the insignia of the Sheikah. Situated in the center of the topmost beam was a gold-crafted eyeball that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Link gently smiled as they passed underneath, but Zelda couldn't help but frown slightly. After passing another gateway similar to the first one and crisscrossing rope keeping a few red-painted wooden planked wind chimes high above, their destination came into view.
Welcome back, Zelda, to Kakariko Village.
The village was located among rolling hills and surrounded by mountains. Except for one exit that led back down the mountain and another leading further into the forest, there were only cliffs, waterfalls, and mountain peaks within view. The village itself was fairly compact. The paths wound through the village on a twisting scenic route with small wooden bridges over the shallow creek that flowed through the center of it all. Most of the houses were similar in style. Each had a basic architecture of wooden beams, white plaster walls, and a domed roof built of straw. Minuscule farms were planted either in front of or between the houses, and crops such as dwarf-sized fruit trees, vibrant pumpkins, and carrots were growing. Like the entrance to the village, the farm plots were adorned with the distinctive wind chimes of red wooden planks suspended with ropes, carefully secured to lantern posts.
It looks the same as it did 100 years ago.
It was one of the few unspoiled places near Hyrule Field. Is it strange to see after everything that's happened?
It's more of a relief, if I'm being honest.
Master Link!
In response to the call of his name, the knight turned his head to see a person stepping out of one of the homes they had ridden past. He was a tall, older man with a huskier build than most of his kind. Owing to his advancing age, fine wrinkles were beginning to form on his forehead, and his mustache had spread from under his large nose across his cheeks. Quickly, the man jogged down the short wooden steps of the home and hurried to the side of the horse.
We could hear the battle from here. If you're here, then the calamity must have been defeated. And if that's the case...
Though his face remained stoic, Zelda could feel Link tense slightly behind her as the older man's eyes rested upon her emerald ones. After a second of hesitation, he nodded. The man's eyes widened as he took a step back from the princess. To her surprise, with a visible tremor, he suddenly bent down to one knee and lowered his head.
You may not understand why I kneel, but I have to say this. I am deeply sorry.
What? Why?
She worriedly looked down at him from the saddle, noticing tears beginning to fall from the man's face, staining both the ground and his thick tan pants and matching coat.
I made a fool of myself in my earlier days, and just recently as well. I owe you this apology because I...
Father! Link!
The man looked over his shoulder and watched as two little white-haired girls came rushing out of the house and jumped onto his large body. Laughing, they crawled over him before they ended up in front of him. Slowly, the man lifted and embraced them into his arms. Closing his eyes, he lowered his head once more as he brought the girls close to his chest.
I'm sorry. I can't explain.
It was at this point she felt Link relax his body.
It's alright, Dorian. It's in the past.
I'm sorry. Link, what?
Before she could finish, Link had already begun shaking his head. Dorian held on to his children for a moment longer before taking a deep breath. He pushed himself to his feet before wiping his tears away onto his sleeve.
Thank you, Link. You really are too kind to me. Forgive me. You were off to see Impa, weren't you?
We were.
Aww. You can't play today? I wanted to play with you. And I wanted to show you my new recipe.
Zelda giggled as Link smiled down at them.
Sorry, you two, but that'll have to wait. You know how important my tasks are. Technically, they were given to me by your leader herself. You can't go against her word now, can you?
Aww.
Now, girls, you two act as though he won't return.
I always come back, don't I? Trust me, I'll return and we'll play together. Besides, I'm excited to try that new recipe of yours, Koko. You know how I am with food. Have you tried it, Katla?
Yeah, it's really tasty.
Then I have to try it. You know I'll always come back for food.
It's true, you know. When it comes to food, he never misses out. I can assure you he'll return if you promise him a good meal.
The two girls stared at the woman sitting in front of Link before turning their attention back to him.
Link, who's that?
This is... well... she's a really important friend of mine.
A slight blush appeared on Zelda's cheeks. She would have been lying to herself if she believed she hadn't been curious as to what his answer would be, or nervous thanks to how long he had taken to answer.
A friend? Is she as old as you are? Yeah. Is she an old lady?
Girls! Princess, I apologize.
Oh, it's fine. I guess you could say I am, but I'm actually a little younger than Link. I'd like to believe I'm just a tad bit more mature, though.
Link frowned, yet the children laughed.
I think we better move along now. I'll be back, okay, you two?
Though the girls looked disappointed, both nodded. With a wave from Dorian and his daughters, Link gave Epona's side a gentle tap with his heel and guided the horse down the path.
It's amazing to see how well you are with children.
Possibly because I'm a bit less mature than you are.
Are you upset? I was just teasing a bit. That's what important friends do, right?
You did well with them too, you know. I don't remember seeing you around kids very often before.
Really? I see. Oh, that Sheikah. Dorian, was it? Why was he apologizing? I noticed you became slightly guarded there for a moment.
He's just a man who cares about his family, and a member of the Sheikah who put his life on the line to protect him from his past. Honestly, I feel a bit guilty for becoming so protective.
I see. This is it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
With a tug on the reins, he brought Epona to a stop. Before them stood a large house, different from the rest in the village. This home was elevated on wooden stilts, built directly in front of the mountain's waterfall, with a tall wooden staircase leading to the front door. The building, instead of straw and plaster, was entirely made of wood with a shingled roof. For certain, it was a building fit for an elder. Jumping down from the saddle, Link held out his hand to the princess, ensuring she would safely plant her feet onto the grass. After a nod and thanks, she looked up at the staircase, pausing to take in the sight.
Is something wrong? You don't seem all too excited.
What makes you ask?
She was, in fact, trying to hide that her heart had begun pounding against her ribcage. Still, it was surprising to find Link could tell something was off from just that alone, yet it was revealed how the moment he gestured downward. In response, Zelda looked to see her thumb and index finger tightly pressed together with a piece of her dirty prayer dress between them.
I somewhat remember you having a fidgeting problem.
I do not.
Everything will be just fine. Come, let's go see your old friend.
The knight held out a hand. Nervously, Zelda looked down at Link's gloved palm before reluctantly placing her hand into it, allowing him to guide her up the stairs. With each step, she could feel her chest tightening. Emotions began to swirl inside of her. Some she knew well, while others were new and unsettling. She became so lost in the feelings that she almost didn't realize the moment they reached the balcony at the top. She looked around, taking in the architecture up close before resting her eyes on the large double doors that stood before them. Her focus on the doors didn't last long, though, for her pointed ears began to twitch. Hearing a scratching sound nearby, she looked around again before realizing there was another person on the balcony with them. She was a taller Sheikah, dressed in a similar traditional garb to what Dorian and his children were wearing. She had incredibly thick, snow-white hair, with half of it styled into a large bun at the top of her head, while the rest traveled down her shoulders and back. At the moment, she was crouching down with a cloth in her hands and wiping the balcony floorboards, hiding her face from sight. Before Zelda could ask who she was, Link simply called out her name.
Paya?
Though his voice was soft, the girl jumped, giving a yelp before turning on her knees to see who'd called her. Zelda's eyes widened, recognizing the rounded face, the large amber eyes, and the painted eye and teardrop insignia on her forehead. Despite her initial thought, it only took one sentence from the girl to realize that this was not her old advisor.
Master Link, thank the goddess, you're okay. Everyone heard the battle from here. I was worried, and...
The woman paused, noticing the person that stood next to him. She brought her hands to her mouth before taking a step back in surprise.
You must be... Prince...
It's okay. You don't need to be so afraid.
I'm not afraid. I'm just bad at speaking at times. You're Princess Zelda, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
The woman paused and took a breath before lowering her hands. Clasping them in front of her, she lowered her head and gave a slight bow.
It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Princess. I am Paya. I'm sure the one you've come to see is my grandmother. Please, I implore that you speak to her at once.
You're Impa's granddaughter? Oh, it's a pleasure to meet you, Paya. I hope we get along.
Likewise.
Zelda's smile faltered. She could have sworn she heard a bit of disappointment in the woman's tone. In fact, she also couldn't help but notice that Paya wouldn't meet her eyes. Yet, before she could question it, Link spoke up.
I believe it's time for you to head inside.
Yes, of course.
After one last glance at Paya, Zelda took a step forward. With a final deep breath of self-encouragement, she placed her hand against one of the wooden doors and slowly pushed it open before stepping inside the house. The door gently closed behind her, leaving Link and Paya alone on the balcony. The two remaining outside stood in silence, though the granddaughter couldn't help but notice the swordsman had imperceptibly relaxed. Rolling his healing shoulder, he walked over to the balcony edge and rested his elbows on the railing, gazing out over the small village below as he listened to the rushing of the waterfall behind the house.
You didn't want to go in with her?
They deserve to have their moment together. Impa will call me if I'm needed.
I see. You're very thoughtful. Though, knowing you, that's to be expected.
Taking in a deep breath of her own to gather her courage, she moved forward to stand next to him, and after an awkward silence, she spoke in a barely audible whisper.
I can't help but notice that you seem a bit distant. Is there, something wrong? Is there any way I could be of assistance?
You think I seem distant?
Finally, Link turned his gaze toward her. Paya's cheeks burned, forcing her to quickly look away.
Just a bit. I guess you're a bit more tense than the last few times you visited. I was just hoping that you were okay.
I'm fine. Sorry. I guess I'm just worried about Zelda, is all.
Zelda, not Princess. She looks as though she hasn't aged a day. She's very pretty.
Link didn't respond immediately, and during his silence, Paya couldn't help but feel a spark of hope appear inside of her. That little light, however, quickly dimmed as he turned to look back out into the village again.
She is.
She stared at him for a moment, watching as a slight breeze gently ruffled his hair before smiling almost sadly.
If you need anything, please remember that I am here.
She crouched down and took the cloth she had left on the balcony in hand before disappearing down the steps, leaving Link alone and oblivious to the true meaning behind her words. Zelda stepped inside, allowing the door to gently close behind her. The common room of the house was a large open space. Rows of pillows were set on the floor, ready to be used for any village meeting that might take place. Spanning across the side walls were multiple shelves filled with trinkets, cookware, clothing, and other necessities. Hanging on the walls themselves was the occasional ornamental tassel, along with a painting of a specific location in Hyrule Field. While the side walls were fairly modest in their decoration, the same couldn't be said for the back. On each end of the back wall was a staircase that led to a second level. The area between them was decorated with lanterns, banners, and more tassels hanging from small wooden pillars surrounding a modest elevated dais with a stack of pillows upon which an incredibly small person sat. She was an elderly, diminutive lady with a face full of wrinkles and liver spots. She wore the same traditional tan, navy, and red garb as the rest of the villagers on her small, frail body. The most noticeable difference from the other villagers was her headgear. On top of her white, bundled hair was a surprisingly large straw hat with heavy metal ornaments hanging from its brim. The older woman didn't seem to respond to Zelda's entrance. In fact, her head was bowed, causing her eyes to be covered by the hat she wore. The moment Zelda took a step forward, the elder slowly raised her head to reveal her tired eyes.
Though my eyes have never once deceived me, I can't help but feel they are lying to me. Princess Zelda, it's so good to see you again.
Impa, you're so...
I know. I'm not the young, nimble assistant I used to be, that is for sure. What are you doing standing over there, girl? Come closer.
The old woman gently patted her leg. Hesitantly, Zelda heeded her words and stepped forward. She walked through the rows of pillows before stopping just in front of the platform. Impa's large dark pupils slowly looked her over, inspecting every inch of her body before looking into her green eyes.
For a moment, I didn't think I'd be here long enough to see the day you would walk through that door. And yet, here you are, standing before me. You look as though you haven't aged a day, and there isn't an injury to be seen on your skin. I couldn't be happier.
Impa, I'm so sorry. I kept you waiting. I kept you worried for so long.
Don't you start with that. I am so proud of you, Princess. You managed to keep the Calamity Ganon at bay for over 100 years. If it weren't for that, or your efforts to place Link and his sword in their resting places, we wouldn't be here talking at this very moment.
But I was too late. Everyone in Hyrule Field and the castle, the champions, my father, all of them lost their lives because I couldn't bring my power out in time.
Slowly, Zelda sank to her knees.
Can you honestly say their lives weren't lost because of me?
I can, and I will. It is no one's fault but the calamities, and I will forever remind you of that. However, nothing I say will rid you of your guilt, at least not right now. But I do want you to believe, at least at some point in the near future, that it was not your fault for what transpired 100 years ago. You saved this kingdom alongside your knight with the help of the 4 champions, just as you were supposed to.
But the kingdom wasn't saved. It's gone, isn't it? Link tried to be vague, to leave room for hope in my heart, but he knows. And so do you. There is no possible way we could call these remains a kingdom. Could we?
Impa stayed quiet for a moment, peering down at her distraught visitor. The old woman took a deep breath.
It is as you say. With what is left, you could not call this your kingdom of Hyrule. I am sorry to say that, in this era of ignorance to what was before, you are a princess no longer.
After those words, the room grew silent, and it remained that way until Zelda, after taking a few seconds to collect herself, spoke up.
What do I do now? I don't have anything. Not even a place to call home. Where do I go from here?
That, I believe, is a choice you must make for yourself. Princess, I know this is a lot to take in, but I do want to remind you of something. This is the first time in your life that you have a choice.
A choice?
Yes. Do not think I've forgotten, even after all this time, how unhappy you were during the times you were stuck inside the walls of the castle. You always seemed happiest when on the road.
Yes, but that was because I felt so constricted. I was stressed because of the responsibilities placed upon me. It felt as though the only time I could breathe was when I was on the road, away from all of it, even if it was just for a short amount of time. I could indulge my studies without being under the watchful eye of my father. I could actually see the kingdom I was trying so hard to protect.
Then why not take the time to breathe once more? Except this time, there isn't any more pressure waiting for you at home.
But where is home, Impa?
Anywhere. You could always live here in Kakariko with me, though you may be better off living with your own kind. Kakariko Village, about a day's journey away from here, is still standing and arguably thriving. I'm sure you could make yourself a home there.
That does sound nice, but you said I have a choice. What is the other option?
While the kingdom of old is gone, that does not mean a new kingdom can't rise from the ashes. But it won't be easy. In fact, regardless of your choice, you will have to start as a normal girl in the eyes of those who remain. It will be a challenging responsibility, but it is one that you alone would put on your shoulders. I, nor anyone else that remains from the original kingdom, will force a burden that large upon you. Not any more.
The room grew quiet again. All that Zelda could hear was the sound of her own breathing. This was her chance. She could finally live without all eyes on her. She could do whatever she wanted at her leisure. It was something she'd wanted more than anything 100 years ago. A simple life, one that demanded nothing of her, and yet something felt off.
Impa, be honest with me. Even if I chose to live a quiet life in Kakariko Village, I'll never truly be normal, will I?
Impa paused before letting out a sigh.
No, you will not. And while none of us elders will force anything more onto you, that does not mean you will live entirely in peace. While you may not be considered royalty, the blood of the goddess still flows in your veins. There is always the possibility that there is more that will demand your attention.
I see. It really is my choice to make.
It is.
Then I choose both.
Both?
I, in good conscience, could never abandon my responsibility as the Princess of Hyrule. I would never be able to forgive myself if I simply allowed it to remain this way, knowing what it once was. But the same way those who live in this era don't know me or anything from before, I don't know them or anything about the land as it is now. I'll live as normal a life as I can, maybe even as a traveller, to find beauty in this new era and do my best to help where I am needed. If a new kingdom arises in the future, then I will take my place on the throne.
Are you sure that is what you want?
Impa, I'm sure you know that Ganon's influence is still spread throughout Hyrule. It's something that Link and I noticed after the beast was sealed, and it's also why you said I might still be needed. It's possible something went wrong, and we both know that Link won't put down his sword, not while monsters remain. He can't be the only one to shoulder the burden of dealing with whatever comes next, especially with the blood that courses through my body.
I see. As different as you are, the two of you still share quite a few similarities. While I said it is your choice, I believe you have chosen wisely.
Zelda gave a small smile, but it didn't last. The moment Impa spoke her next words, her heart dropped.
This does leave one final question, though. If we are to properly forego your title as the princess, then it is only right to give the last person assigned to you a choice of his own.
With pain in her heart, Zelda looked down. She knew this would come to pass eventually. It was unreasonable to assume that she could keep Link by her side at all times. It was also unfair to believe that he would just leave and never see her again. She knew they would always be friends, and yet something inside of her hated the idea of him not being around constantly. She had grown to like his presence, more than even she herself could fully admit, even now.
Zelda. He must be given the option to walk his own path. It's the right thing to do.
Tears once again formed in Zelda's eyes, yet she hesitantly nodded in agreement.
Then if you would please send him in, it's time for him to make his choice.
Thank you for listening to this chapter of the Couple of the Wild audioplay. Let us know what your favorite part was in the comments, and if you'd like to see future chapters, please make sure to subscribe. We appreciate all your support. We hope to see you next time. Thank you.